E.N.D here. One of the most impactful mechanics introduced in the Lorwyn Shadow Mode block was Persist. This beloved ability is set to make a comeback in Lorwyn Eclipse, albeit in a minor capacity, as it will appear on the backside of E.N.D, Carrier of Dawn, who transforms into Izilu, Carrier of Twilight, giving each other non-talking creature you control Persist. Persist is a keyword ability introduced in Shadow Mode. When a permanent with Persist dies, if it had no -1/-1 counters on it, it returns to the battlefield under its owner's control with a -1/-1 counter on it. Essentially, it gives creatures a second chance at life. But how do you play Persist? Let's build our battlefield and let's cast Putrid Goblin. Putrid Goblin. 1 and 1 black. 2/2 with Persist. Any spell with Persist, it's a normal spell. Therefore, when casted, it will go on the stack. There can be a counter, there can be a response, nothing happens, and Putrid Goblin will hit the battlefield. At this stage, Putrid Goblin is just a 2/2. But when Putrid Goblin dies, it will go to the graveyard and come back with a -1/-1 counter on it. Putrid Goblin has been destroyed. Because Putrid Goblin, when it was destroyed, didn't have any -1/-1 counters on it, it will come back on the battlefield with a -1/-1 counter on it. Now, Putrid Goblin is a 1/1. Because Putrid Goblin has a -1/-1 counter on it, when it dies, it will not return back. Putrid Goblin has been shocked. No return back. If Putrid Goblin dies, comes back thanks to Persist with a -1/-1 counter, and you find a way to remove the -1/-1 counter, dies, it will return back again with a -1/-1 counter. Some notes: all cards currently printed with Persist are creatures. If a creature with Persist stops being a creature, for example, if a creature with Persist becomes a non-creature artifact due to being enchanted by Swift reconfiguration, Persist will still trigger. Likewise, if a non-creature permanent becomes a creature, gains Persist and dies, the Persist ability will still trigger even though that permanent won't be a creature when it returns to the battlefield. If a permanent has multiple instances of Persist, they each trigger separately, but the redundant instances will have no effect. If one instance returns the card to the battlefield, any others will do nothing since the card is no longer in a graveyard. If a card with Persist is removed from a graveyard before the Persist ability resolves, Persist will do nothing. Tokens can gain Persist and the ability will trigger if a token dies. However, like all tokens, it can't return to the battlefield and will cease to exist as state-based action before the ability would go on the stack. When a permanent with Persist dies and then returns to the battlefield, it becomes a new object with no memory of its previous existence. It has summoning sickness. Persist triggers when the permanent is put into a graveyard and relies on the last known information about that permanent when it left the battlefield. If a permanent with a +1/+1 counter on it receives enough -1/-1 counters to reduce its toughness to 0 or less, or have lethal damage marked on it, it won't return on the battlefield despite the state-based action of a +1/+1 counter and a -1/-1 counter cancelling each other out. As the permanent last existed on the battlefield had a -1/-1 counter on it, Persist won't trigger. So that's how you play Persist. It's a very interesting returning mechanic in Lorwyn Eclipse. Leave me a comment below what do you think about Persist in Standard. And as always, subscription button is here. Subscribe to my channel for more and more interesting videos about Magic the Gathering and the collectible world. Liliana!